Wellness Show. The spirit, news, and information from a higher perspective. Your host, Harry Wilkinson. Hello and welcome. Welcome to the Spirit and Wellness Show. This is the show where we take a look at the days and weeks events, happenings all across the globe, happenings in international news, politics, happenings in the world of technology, economics, everything we hear about, interact with during the course of our week, and we take a step back and we take a look at it from a higher perspective. My name is Harry Wilkinson. I'm your host. I've been doing this show for quite a few number of years here, maybe 5 or 6, I think. And it is something I have done as a way to help me focus on healthy ways to interact with our media and news stories and the world around us and what's happening around us. I have to remind myself of the nature of what is happening, because the information that comes at us so quickly now through an ever-increasing variety of means can feel so overwhelming. Right, it really can. I mean, it can just feel like one more thing happening. And this is a very deliberate choice by those in the media who are what we call gatekeepers. Gatekeepers are people like editors and news bureaus that make choices about the stories that they are going to use in their news broadcast and their coverage, but not only just the stories they're going to tell, but how they're going to tell them and frame them, and they're done in ways that are as in many ways as attention-getting. You might even call them salacious or button-pushing. Anything that gets the attention, good or bad, of the public, whether it be to inflame or excite or frustrate or terrify, which more often than not that's what they go for. That's what's presented. And so when these illusions are presented in front of you sort of non-stop, it can feel overwhelming, and it can feel like the world is a much crazier place than it actually is. So the perspective that I come from is one of I guess you can call it a metaphysical perspective, a perspective that we, as beings who are not our bodies, more than our bodies, at the highest level of our being, that metaphysical level, we are creating everything that we experience. Because at that level, we are creators. At that level, we have extraordinary power and ability. We are not subject to things that our smaller selves are. Fears and thoughts of weakness and lack and loss and all of those things. At that level, at the highest level, we know none of that truly exists. However, we create these experiences sort of to have them and to reawaken or re-excite and expand the understanding of our smaller selves. In a nutshell, that's what the higher perspective means. And we've been talking about, the past couple of episodes here, we've been talking about the states of consciousness that humans have, what consciousness is, and in relation to, particularly to certain psychotropic chemicals and drugs that are now becoming more used and examined by science than they have been for over 40 years. We are talking about things like psilocybin and other drugs that have sort of had a pall over them from the 60s, and that seems to be changing. So we're going to talk more about that today. We've been talking about what consciousness is. But one of the things that is common in some of the mystical experiences, and even some of the experiences that have been induced by varying chemicals, of which we're talking about, is this sense of observing oneself from a higher vantage point, seeing things happen to that self, and not feeling threatened or frightened or any of the emotions that we tend to grapple with in our daily lives, but just knowing that it's okay. Many people have had that experience, and that's kind of what I'm talking about. So anyway, onward and upward, we are going to continue our discussion of mystic science. Last week, our episode was on the rise of the mystic scientist. And as quantum theory and quantum physics begins to reveal more about how the world works and how we create things, the more or closer or more entwined science starts to become with the mystical traditions, the mystical wisdom that has been around for ages. Much of what's going on in that area of science is proving in a very real way truths that have been known for many, many centuries. Now, traditional science is grappling hard with this, and traditional scientists quite often are not on board with some of the theories that are coming out of the quantum physics corner of their world. And their concern about it is that they feel that these theories don't have enough empirical evidence to support them. And my theory, which I talked about last week, is that the scientific method as it has existed is blown out of the water by what we now know from quantum physics, which is the idea that the observed responds to the observer. In other words, it's not possible to observe something from a completely objective viewpoint because the observer always affects what is being observed. Now, you can sort of take precautions against that in your studies using the scientific method. Remember, scientific method is all about observation, and it rests on the assumption that you can observe something and observe its behavior very clinically without interfering in it, and through those observations you can determine answers to questions, the nature of whatever it is you're observing. Well, if what you're observing is responding to your observation of it, how can you ever know from an objective point of view? So, you will hear from traditional scientists who kind of have a thing against some of the theories like string theory, which we've talked about, from quantum physics, because they say it doesn't have empirical evidence to support it. Well, round and round we go with this argument, because there's no way to do that when you are studying certain things. And the kind of approach that we've been used to for centuries in science is quickly revealing a lot of flaws to itself. When you are studying the nature of quantum reality, you can't rely on the traditional ideas of observation. I would postulate that you can't, in any kind of situation anymore, now that we know the truth, that we are observing our own observation in many ways. But certainly, if you can observe rocks and plants, it's probably easier to make certain assumptions or determinations about them than it is when you're trying to study something like consciousness. And that may be why we don't have a lot of people who study consciousness in the scientific community, because they are aware of the limitations of studying what consciousness is. So there have been, though, certain scientists who have ventured into that realm to study what consciousness is and the effects of consciousness. So we're going to talk about some of them today, and we're going to talk about what consciousness is and what the different states of consciousness are, and how we might be able to be more in control, or at least more open to them. Let's put it that way. So the first person that I want to draw your attention to is the guy that whose work seems to have been the landmark study that has brought psychedelic chemicals to a greater and wider scientific audience. And his name is Griffiths. Dr. Roland Griffiths, and he wrote